Yeah, I posted like what do I absolutely need, like help me, like for our baby registry kind of thing.
Yeah.
And his response, I bet you could even guess it. But exactly, yeah, you're gonna need it.
I saw, hey Cam, they hi.
Hey Cam. Hey Cam.
I don't know why I came across my, I can't remember that, I maybe shop record, anyway. This girl, she's like, I'm not buying anything for your baby. She goes, because you got plenty of people that are gonna do that, she goes, I'm gonna buy a bunch of stuff for you. So it was all like, some pretty personal products that she need after that event, so I really thought that was pretty smart. It was like a whole, she like put this little 3-tier rolling cart together.
Oh,
And had it all, different levels of different types of needs.
yeah,
So that's cool.
that's such a good idea. That's from someone who's had a baby.
Yeah, that's what she said. That is what she said.
Cause it's more fun to buy the cute clothes.
Sure.
But she's right that people are gonna get that. And
Yeah.
even like if I go into Target, I'm looking at the baby stuff,
Right.
and I will walk away with something because I can't help myself.
Sure.
Go.
Yeah. Oh, I'm good. How are you?
Okay. Good, we got them so far. Can y'all hear us okay?
Yes, we can.
Super. Y'all have good weekends?
It was a great weekend.
Good. Do something exciting?
No, just hung out with family. Actually, the kids were all over, so it was nice watching football, drinking beer, the way it should be.
Yeah. We did a lot of football watching this weekend. Sadly, Tyler's a big Packers fan, so that wasn't as fun. But we still watched it. Last night's game was good.
It was a great game.
It's so relaxing watching football when you don't really care who wins.
Exactly. I'm a Falcons fan. I've been in this situation a lot.
Yeah. But it's nice. It's like Tyler's a Packers fan, but not like we're Alabama fans. So when they lost, he was upset for a couple minutes and then we moved on with life. Whereas when Alabama loses, it's like we don't move on for a little bit. Myself. So do y'all have any questions to kick us off? Anything y'all are seeing over the weekend that you wanted to talk about?
I think I need the answer. I got a dumb situation. It's kind of dumb.
Okay.
I'm buying 140 acres. 100 acres owned by one family, 40 acres owned by another family, let's just say. The purchase of this whole thing together is contingent on each one being agreed upon. And the 40 acres signed the deal, everything was fine. And we're kind of like lumping it all together. And it's kind of weird how they have it worked out with their splits, but we know we have to do 2 separate contracts because it is 2 separate buyers. So we have to have 2 separate closings. But it's contingent on each other.
Two
I'm the
separate
buyer.
buyers or two separate sellers?
I'm the buyer, so 2 separate sellers, sorry.
Okay.
And we got the first one of the 40 acres, we got that signed and returned. But the 100 acres, we haven't got it back yet. And we were kind of like, well, they're going together because we're going to like put down all the earnest money together and all that kind of stuff together, even though they have separate amounts on each offer. But it's all kind of understood that, hey, we're doing this as one transaction. So where we agreed to put up $150,000 earnest money, the 40 acres we get 50,000 or whatever, the 100 acres we get 100,000. But we haven't gotten the contract back yet for the 100 acres. And I should have that back any day now, but they're saying, hey, we want our earnest money. My guy's like, I want the contract to be complete. And I'm like, well, we kind of have this complete. He's like, it is complete, but it's contingent on this one. We don't have this one yet. So I see both sides because we do have a separate contract with the 40 acres, but it's contingent on the 100 acres also working out.
Did you put language in your contract that that the two contracts are contingent upon each other?
Yes, 100%.
So typically the way I see that written, and I'm not sure how you structured that stip for each one, but typically it's contingent, like the closings are contingent upon each other, meaning the buyer doesn't have to buy the 40 acres unless they're also buying the 100 acres and vice versa. What's not contingent upon each other is turning in the earnest money. So if they're saying we want our $50,000 of earnest money because we have a bound contract, they would be right, you need to go ahead and get the 50 turned in. Now, if the holder is the same for both earnest monies, what I would do is go ahead and send it. Are y'all holding it, or is the attorney gonna hold it?
The attorney's holding it.
Okay, so I would probably, depending on what the due date is for the earnest money, I would go ahead and send in the 50. If you want to go ahead and send in the 150, if the other contract terminates, then the attorney can send 100 of it back. The only downside to just sending one wire of 150 is that if the other one terminates, the attorney's gonna have to do that $100,000 separate. They can't just reject the wire because they need to keep the 50,000 for the contract that is already under contract, right? Already turned in.
If the 100 doesn't work, then the 50, then the 40 is out of the question. We're going to terminate that one too. But it's contingent, like I say, it's one big plot of land and just little 40 acres is cut out. It's going to be this landlocked around this acreage. So it's kind of like, I don't know, it's kind of a weird situation. My guy's like, I don't want to see, like, I don't want to buy it. I'm not going to, he's like, I'll turn in the money when we get the 100 acres signed. And I mean, hopefully today we get the 100 acres signed and it's a moot point. But in the meantime, I told him, I said, well, we need to turn in earnest money. And he goes, I don't have both contracts yet. And I'm like, I know, but we have one done and complete. He's like, yeah, but it's contingent on the other one. So we really don't have a full complete contract because it's contingent on this one being signed and that one's not signed yet. And I'm like,
no, because you probably didn't write the stip to make the 40 acres contingent on the 100 acres being signed. You probably wrote both stips. And it probably is the way I would suggest making them contingent on the other one closing, right? I'm not gonna do anything on contract A until contract B is signed. It's very rare that people structure it like that. And it's not really good at the end of the day for the buyer to structure it that way. Because then, once this one's signed, you're locked in, and if this one terminates, then you're still stuck with this one. So you want them to be structured to be contingent upon the other one closing, but that doesn't change the obligation of the earnest money. So I would tell your client, hey, yes, they're contingent upon each other closing, like you don't have to buy one if you're not buying the other, but the obligation to turn in earnest money for this one exists, and your deadline is here. Now, if the other one doesn't work out, we can get that 50 grand back, but you're not relieved of your obligation to turn it in just because this other one isn't signed. Again, unless you wrote the stip in kind of a weird, unique way, but I'm guessing you just made the purchases contingent on each other, which is the right way to do it.
yeah, I did. It's like the 40 acres contingent on the sale of the adjoining property. And
vice versa.
We're not sold yet. That's why he's like, it's not complete because it says it's on the sale of that property and we're not done yet. And I'm like, well, I see your point, but I don't see your point because this contract specifically says we have to have that money turned in within, I mean, it's a cash deal. I mean, this is going to be my biggest one. It's $2.6 million. And
that's amazing. Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. And I got to make sure that I got to keep him happy. Got to massage his ego a little bit and let him know that just go ahead and turn in all the earnest money today just to be safe and have it done. And then
Yeah. Now, the only thing to be careful with is obviously they're contingent on each other. If for whatever reason, the 100-acre contract never gets signed, to terminate the 40-acre contract that's already signed, it can't just be like, the day after they say, we're not signing it. If you terminate, you could lose the buyer the earnest money, because if the contingency is upon the closing date has to come and go, or else the seller there is still some obligation or some opportunity to fulfill that obligation. So just be careful with that. A mutual termination would probably be your best bet. And if all parties are on the same page, there should be no issue with that. But just be careful if for whatever reason the other one doesn't get signed, which seems unlikely, but just again, be careful.
I gave us like a 15-day due diligence period, which is not necessary. He's ready to close right away, but I gave us enough time just to make sure that everything is signed. We're going to get, some testing of the soil done this week. But other than that, it was like pretty easy. But I did ask for the earnest money they wanted it delivered quickly. And I said, we can do that within 2 days of binding. And my buyer was fine with that. He's a cash buyer. So he said, okay. So we decided to do it. And then now it's like, I'm not doing it yet because they haven't signed yet. And I mean, they're not hold up for anything other than just because it's through a trust. Dad passed away. Now the daughter's an executor and they're going through all of that stuff. They've been doing that for years. But now they just want their lawyers to look at everything to make sure that the contract is good before they give up this land. And they have one little 7 or 3/4 of an acre cut out with his old house where mom lives in it now. And we wanted to buy that too, and they wouldn't sell it to us. So now we had to write in the special stip of also with that 100 acres, we get right of first refusal if they ever decide to change the property or sell the property or change the name on the deed. We have first right of refusal of that property at a set price. And we really had to go back and rewrite this thing like 5 different times just for the correct verbiage of you promised to sell us the house first when mom passes away, basically. And
Yeah.
it's kind of a pain.
So it sounds like it's not really, there could be some additional changes on language, but it's not like they don't want to sell it. So your seller, either way, your buyer needs to go ahead and turn in the earnest money for the 40-acre bit. But I would let him know that he could get it back if the other one never goes under contract. You got to do it correctly, but it's not like that money is gone forever. So it's contingent. Yeah, the other thing to keep in mind, which I don't recommend doing this, but just for like your own peace of mind and comfort, know that if he doesn't turn in earnest money, then the holder has to send notice at a reasonable time after the deadline has passed that the earnest money was not received. And so then he would have 3 banking days to cure the default before the seller would have the right to terminate. So you do have a little bit of a cushion. That being said, the seller could terminate incorrectly, and the only thing the buyer could do would be to sue them to get them to force them to sell the house, right? So that's not ideal, but if he just flat out refuses, don't panic, because he does have that cushion. Again, 3 banking days from the day notice from the holder is received. So for your peace of mind.
Perfect. Yeah. I mean, he's pretty understanding. Hopefully we'll get it done today. Everything will be sewed up nice and pretty. But I just was like, he kind of threw a wrench at me going, no, I'm not turning it in yet because we have to have this other one, but it makes sense. I appreciate it.
Yeah, anytime. Anyone else seen anything interesting that they want to chat about?
So we tried to get O'Kelly to close this one, but he's like, no, I want my attorney to close it.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I'm like, really? I've got the greatest one. He says, we'll use my attorney. Fine.
Is his attorney a closing attorney though?
Yes, it is a real estate attorney.
Which is different.
Reginald A. Hudgepeth, LLC. And they're in Swanee. And
I don't know that.
I don't know. They're small, but they're little operation out of Swanee, but that's his attorney, and he's used him for several multi-million-dollar deals in the Decula area. And he's the developer that's going to, buying a lot of land around Decula. And he's done them all. So I'm like, well, I called them, talked to them. There's a real person there. They seem legit.
If he does always return it, he should send it to earnest money.
Yeah.
You did. Maybe so. Well, that's exciting. That's your biggest one ever, though. That's awesome,
Oh.
Cam.
Exactly. I said, I was telling David, I said, I want it to be 2.6 million, but instead it's 1.7 and 800,000. It's two separate deals. I said, I wanted a big two in front of it, but it'd be perfectly fine.
That's okay. Two checks to you that add up to the same amount feels just as good as the one.
Exactly.
And when you like post about it on your social media, there's nothing deceptive, because together your guy spent $2 million on the huge piece of property. You don't have to be like, it was split up into two.
You're
So,
absolutely right.
posting about it. So that's all that matters, is what your sphere sees, and then more importantly, the money that goes in your pocket. And both of those, doesn't matter if it's one or two.
Exactly right. No, I'm excited.
All good stuff. Anybody else seen anything? Any weird issues come up with the new contracts? Have we started using those and seen anything crop up? No, smooth sailing. We got it all down pat and zero mistakes are being made.
Everything was fine with this one. Like I say, there's no problems.
That's great. That is great.
I'm on board to say thank you for being here, Ashley. Thank goodness I don't have a problem today, but thank you guys. And I haven't used the new contract yet. So, and I need to review and see what the changes are and look for your next class. I probably missed one or two already, I'm sure, but thank you guys for being here this morning. It's always fun to listen and I always learn. So thank you guys very much.
Oh, of course. We enjoy being here. Thanks for joining. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, so I did teach a CE class in December on it, but I think there have been a lot of people who weren't able to be there. So probably my next like 1 hour class, I'll just zip through all of the changes, kind of like a higher level rather than really digging into the contracts, because I can't do that in an hour. I can barely do it in the 3 hours. So
That would be
what the next one is. What?
That would be phenomenal. Thank you. And sorry I missed it. I vaguely remember that, but yeah. And yeah, just we'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think what the most interesting change, I know that you've heard of all the commission talks and you're gonna continue to hear about that. So aside from that, which I don't even know that that is the biggest change of the form, since we were already kind of moving towards handling it that way, kind of heading in that direction from the change from last year. But what I do think is super substantive and interesting, like the two biggest ones that y'all are gonna operate differently as far as like writing your contracts and understanding your contracts, is they changed the way the amendatory clause is put into the contract. You know, for your FHA and your VA exhibits, it's used to just be the amendatory clause there. Now they've broken that up into 2 paragraphs. So the one paragraph is the amendatory clause, verbatim how like HUD and the VA show it. And then there's another paragraph explaining how it works. But the big change this time around is they've changed the hierarchy somewhat. It used to be that the amendatory clause controlled over everything, period, which meant you couldn't really amend the sales price, right? Like if your sales price is 400,000 and the appraisal comes back at 390, the last change we had said that the buyer had to give the seller the opportunity to reduce it and they would close, which didn't give us a whole lot of structure on how we were supposed to do that. Before, the buyer could say, oh yeah, I want to close at 390, they could sign an amendment and they did, and then the day before closing, they could say, oh, well, the amendatory clause trumps it, I don't want to buy it anymore, and they could walk. Which was not a great system, a little bit unfair to the sellers, right? If everyone has agreed on it in writing, you should be stuck with what you've agreed to. So they have updated that to where now we can do an amendment for the sales price, and that will control over that amendatory clause. So know that you have that in your back pocket to actually use and be relied on. We were doing it before, but with the understanding that it didn't really mean a whole lot. Now it actually carries the weight of a true amendment. So I think that's a little bit different than how we've been operating, and super important if you handle a lot, or even just handling one FHA or VA contract, that amendatory clause was broken up to be a little bit more evenly split rather than being a little bit unfair, if you will, to the sellers. So that's one. The other one I think you're gonna use a lot and you wanna be super aware of. Haven't decided whether this is gonna be a popular change or not, but it is with the CAD, which I know traditionally that's been like the most adjusted part of the contract over the last several years. We've had a little bit of a break the last couple years, our last couple of changes on not messing with the CAD too much. We didn't mess with a lot of stuff, but one thing that is different is that the assessments, so your seller on the CAD is disclosing what the either annual, semi-annual, monthly, quarterly, whatever assessment is, and then how that's broken down. They changed it to where it's clear whether it's gonna be like a calendar year or a fiscal year. But more importantly, and the change that I want y'all to be careful with, because it's gonna change how you approach your sellers with the CAD, is now kind of like the transfer initiation fee. If the seller discloses that assessment incorrectly, then they are liable for that difference for the rest of the year. So let's say the seller says it's $800 a year, but it's really $1,000 a year. Then they're gonna prorate on the 800, but the extra 200, the seller just has to give the buyer, right? Because they under disclosed. So if your seller is under disclosing, now they're also responsible for that difference. Same thing if it's monthly. Okay, so if they said it's $100 a month and it's really $120 a month, and you're closing in March, not only are we gonna adjust March to be correctly, but your seller is gonna owe the buyer $20 for April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December. Okay, so 9 months, so is that $180? So when you're approaching the CAD with your sellers, know that obviously you should never fill this out. You should never be the one calling the HOA for this information, because if you give bad information, they're gonna look at you and blame you at the table first off, saying, well, you got it, you should pay the difference. But you're telling your seller, not only are they calling to ask for the total amount due at closing, because you wanna get the transfer initiation, capital contribution, whatever funny name they use, that really is one of those fees, you wanna get that total amount so you can disclose it. You also want them to confirm what that assessment is, so they can disclose that correctly as well. So that seems to be a pretty big change, which I think is gonna help you guys out quite a bit, because how often do you see a closing letter where the monthly fee is wrong? Probably pretty often.
Not a ton, sometimes, but not a ton. We're getting docs also that ask that, through the process if it's a condo. So if it's not a condo, we're not getting anything,
Yeah,
in terms of that. So yeah, it could be a little bit different.
and I think where you're gonna see that the most is gonna be, you go under contract in December or beginning of January,
It's changing.
and it's changing for the year. And so, I mean, for people with like buyers with a really tight debt to income ratio, the monthly fee going from 80 to 100 might be detrimental if it's super, super tight. So this, I think, will help out everybody, but it's certainly gonna hurt the sellers who don't bother to call and ask. So even the sellers who are like, I know what my HOA is, I would specifically say, I know that, but I would call and confirm, because what if they're updating the amount and they just haven't confirmed that to you guys? Or what if you missed a piece of mail? You're already gonna call for this. Just double check it. And if they don't, like, whatever, it's not really your problem, but you specifically told them, hey, this is gonna be your problem if you don't disclose it correctly. I suggest you double check. And that's all you can do to try to save them some money on that front.
Yeah. So one thing that I've seen a lot, now y'all especially, well, I guess not just buyers agents, but we've had a few over this last month where the houses have had, I don't wanna say issues, but like, I feel like we're seeing more people terminating due to inspection issues, or really having a lot of issues brought up on the inspection that they want to negotiate and all that good stuff. We had two that were real close to terminating, both of them are gonna make it, but, I did feel like bringing this up would be a good topic. The particular one that I'm doing, she's got a handful of, quotes out there. One is for, water in the crawl space, so that one's not cheap. One is for some roof things, also not cheap. So several $1,000s in repairs. So she wanted to obviously have the seller either do the work, she's okay doing the work, my buyer, as long as it's stuff that can be done after. So I kind of wanted to recap a couple of things. If you're asking for money instead of the repairs to be done on something, and when you do your ATAC, you make sure you're calling the lender, call us and make sure that you know exactly how much you can ask for. What's the max based on what kind of loan they're doing, how much they're putting down. If it's conventional and they're putting down less than 10%, you can only get 3% of that sales price in money. Now, they can do a ton more repairs, doesn't matter what those cost. But if you're just asking for money and the buyer's gonna just do stuff later, know what your limits are. My particular person was putting down 10%, so she could get up to 6% of the sales price. So the agent and I were talking through it. However, I mean, that was almost 20 grand. Well, she doesn't have costs that are 20 grand on her, her closing costs and stuff. So we had to figure out, okay, ask for, 15 or 14,000, I think, in money, and then the other stuff that would add up to that amount, then she's gonna ask them to actually do the repairs. They can be paid at closing, so the seller doesn't have to come out of pocket. But it's really coming up with that plan to make sure that you're structuring your ATAX in a way that your buyer is getting all of the benefits, either getting the work done or getting the money to do it. But if she had just put on there, hey, we want 20 grand towards seller to pay 20 grand for closing costs, and my buyer's closing costs are only 14, that buyer's losing $6,000, because the seller does not have to do anything with it. Obviously, they can't just give it to her. So just knowing, again, what your limits are based on the loan. And, let's get creative. If she can't use all that money, but she wants that money, let's think of other things to ask them. If an appraisal is done on the property and it comes back as is, meaning the appraisal is not calling out any of the things that the inspection did that she wants fixed, then anything with that additional, say, 6 grand that my agent was gonna ask them to repair, they could either put that in a repair escrow and have it done after closing, and the attorney holds that repair escrow and sends the money to the contractor who's fixing it. As long as the appraisal's as is, the lender does not have to be involved. We don't have to be setting up that repair escrow. We don't have to be okaying what it is. If the appraiser were to call something out like, hey, there's a roof leak, this needs to be fixed, there's no doing that in the repair escrow afterwards. If it's on the appraisal to be done, it has to be done and repaired and confirmed before the closing happens. So just knowing what can we put off for an escrow, how do we get all the money from the seller for these repairs in, either in cash or to be fixed. In this case, they're not doing a repair escrow, they're just gonna do the other work for that 6 grand and pay it at closing, which she's fine with. So everybody kind of wins. But it can be tricky, and I don't want you to miss out on any of the money if you're asking for a flat amount and they can't use it all for closing costs.
And I would say a couple things to add on that topic, because we are seeing that more and more as well. The first thing I would caution y'all is, take what you get. But I would caution y'all to not do a repair escrow. First off,
That is the last place option.
that's the
I
last.
will tell you.
Not that people won't do it, and it can work out, but I would try my darndest to not do that. And here's why. A lot of lenders won't approve it, and the closing attorney represents the lender. So I can't hold that money in escrow unless the lender tells me that's okay. And a lot of times lenders will either say, well, I don't care what you do, but I can't give you approval, which is the exact same thing as no, because if I don't have approval, I'm not authorized by my client to do that. Or they'll say, well, what are those repairs? And then all of a sudden they've taken an interest in what those repairs are. And maybe your appraisal didn't mention it. Maybe your appraiser missed something. And then all of a sudden it's like, there's a gas leak. the lender's always gonna want the gas leak fixed because the house could blow up. That's a problem if they don't have collateral anymore, right? So a lot of times that opens a can of worms with the lender, but even if we get past all of that, there's still an argument on the other side as far as releasing those escrow funds. And so the way that we'll set it up, and any closing attorney should set it up to have a really clear path on what to do with that money, which means one party or the other is gonna essentially hold all the power. So if there is a lender, I can't set up an escrow holdback, like a repair escrow, to say, if X, Y, Z isn't done, I'm gonna give this money to the buyer. Because a lot of lenders won't approve that either. So it's not like everyone thinks, oh, repair escrow, I'm just gonna throw it in there and it'll be great and it'll take care of itself. It might be fine, but you definitely wanna call the attorney and ask like, hey, is this feasible? Can we set this up? What all needs to happen? Because it's hard when you've got a contract that says closing attorney to hold $6,000 in escrow, then all of a sudden the lender says, no, we can't do that. Or sometimes the attorney will say, no, we can't do that. Like, there are limits to how long we can hold it, and if this is gonna be a year down the road, that's probably not feasible for the attorney to hold anyway. And now you have this issue of the contract saying, like, buyer and seller have agreed this, but the party that really is gonna be obligated to hold it hasn't agreed to it. So I would say call before you jump straight to that. A couple better options, if you're working on an ATAC, you know this ahead of time, what I would suggest is having the buyer, if they really wanna do the work and you have the issue of not enough closing costs, or maybe you've hit the limit as far as what the lender is, or what the loan allows for the seller credit or any credits to be, the seller can pay these things at closing, and maybe your buyer wants control over it, so they want new windows, they wanna pick out the windows, they want Windows R Us to install them. So you get a quote from Windows R Us they say it's gonna be $10,000. So your stipulation or your ATAC would say, seller to pay Windows R Us $10,000 at closing, closing attorney to give check to buyer. So seller proceeds from that will pull the $10,000, we'll cut the check to the vendor the buyer wants, but then I give the check to the buyer, so that the buyer can pay the vendor when the work is done. That's a better, cleaner option than having something survive closing, because if you're doing a repair escrow, you wanna put language in that ATAC or an amendment if it's not gonna be done. You're learning this like a little bit closer to closing, but it's not gonna be done. You wanna say that these obligations, this amendment survives closing. If you don't say it survives closing, basically, at the closing, there's paperwork signed saying all terms of the contract have been met unless otherwise specified. So you have to otherwise specify and say it survives the closing. So then you have the issue of if you're really having the seller do it after the fact. If they don't do it and you have this repair escrow, then that could cover it. But since the attorney can't give it to the buyer, we really need the vendor's name from the get-go anyway. So rather than structuring it like that, just have us cut the check to the vendor, give it to the buyer, and then the buyer's in total control, because the buyer's always gonna do a little bit better job as far as managing the repairs than the seller, because the buyer's gonna want it to their specifications to be right, to be pretty, to be all the things. The seller's gonna try to find the cheapest way to accomplish what they're obligated to do. And that doesn't mean the seller is sketchy, it just logically, why would the seller go above and beyond on a property they're not gonna have anymore? So I would go that route. Alternatively, if you have enough room in the loan, but you don't have enough actual cost, closing costs are really anything that's related to the loan. So, double check, or related to the closing, double check with your lender. But what I've also seen be successful is, let's say the seller says, I don't want to pay Windows R Us, but I'm happy giving you that $20,000. You can say buyer to pay Windows R Us $10,000 at closing and make your seller credit $20,000. Now you have plenty of room. Again, the lender has to approve that. But a lot of times that works out because they know you need new windows for the house. It's not like buyer to pay for their Disney vacation, right? That's not relevant to the transaction. But if it's relevant to the purchase, you can also put it on the buyer side and have the seller credit. Utilize that, which is what we suggest too if we've run out of costs, because sometimes, unfortunately, agents don't call the lender first and they say $20,000, lender says, you only have 14,000 worth of costs. We're looking for costs to eat into what the seller can possibly give. Again, as long as we're within like the limit set by the amount down and the sales
That's an
price.
interesting one though, because devil's advocate, I could see the underwriter saying, well, it's incentive, well, maybe if it's still within the amount. You know, because sometimes what they're looking for is, are they incentivizing above and beyond them to buy the house? You know, with, by saying, okay, you pay it, we'll pay for it. But, yeah, that's interesting. I've never had anyone do that.
I've had that work a couple times.
Yeah, I
So,
like that.
some sellers just, maybe the sellers have had a really bad experience with Windows R Us and.
I was just gonna say, but I guess it would have to be if, because I have experienced the other one.
Mhm.
I would have to be if that one they didn't want to do because for some reason they didn't want to write a check to her.
Yeah, and
So that's
sometimes,
probably why if you not.
sometimes people's decisions will defy logic.
Oh,
So, and I've had it before
We all know
where,
that.
like, someone was totally fine giving a $5,000 carpet credit, but refused to give a $5,000 seller credit, because the lender didn't like the word carpet. And they're like, nope, I'm not covering any closing costs, I won't do it. And no matter how we told them, like, $5,000 is $5,000, like, truly, why do you care? Nope, she cared, and that was that. So sometimes you'll have sellers that are like that. Sometimes the buyer doesn't want the seller to feel like they have control over certain things, and so this is probably more along the scenario where the sellers agreed to give this like $20,000, and then the buyer finds out that they don't have enough costs. Sometimes if it's like a tumultuous transaction, you would, in order for us to say the closing cost is 14,000 and seller's gonna pay Windows R Us 6,000, we have to have an amendment, because that changes the contract. So buyers can get nervous about having the seller sign another amendment and telling them, oh, we don't have enough closing costs, and thinking that's gonna give seller a power to say, well, I guess I'm only giving 14, sucks to suck. And so that sometimes can happen as well. And again, that scenario would be a reason to use, we'll just put it on the buyer side and then we can utilize the full 20,000. As long as the issue is that you're within the limit set by the loan, how much you're putting down, there's just not enough costs. If you hit the limit allowed by the loan based off of what you're putting down, you can't add additional costs to cover it. It's gotta go on the seller side. But it's just some tools, so I would recommend first, call your lender, figure out what those limits are, and then call me so we can structure it most efficiently. Because fooling with trying to get money after a closing is not as easy as already having the money in your pocket to make the payment every time.
and you want to only make one amendment. For that exact reason, to go back and change it later, the seller, I mean, could be kind of a punk and be like, no, even if it nets them no different. Sometimes they see an opportunity to either give less than agreed, or, you know, maybe they just think you've nitpicked their house and now they don't like you anyway, you know, people are weird.
Yes.
So,
And that happens too. The other thing I'll say about an ATAC while we're talking about that is if what you're gonna do, like, let's say you want the $20,000, there's plenty of costs for your closing, it's within the limit, like, there's no issue. Don't use the ATAC to say seller credit is $20,000. Because what that's gonna do is, it's amendment to address concerns. So you're saying, I have $20,000 worth of concerns on this house. So naturally, a lender's gonna be like, what $20,000 issue do we have? And maybe it's you just wanna replace every single window, which maybe not a big deal, maybe it is, I don't know, but it's gonna raise the red flag. So if you're just doing money, use a regular amendment, seller credit is $20,000. If you're gonna do, like, seller credit is 14,000, and then seller to pay Windows R Us, seller to pay We Love Toilets, like whatever, ATAC is fine.
is that a company?
But it should be. Why not? People
That's
spend time. But you can use the ATAC if it's money and other things. But if it's just money, just a seller credit, use a regular amendment.
Easier,
Yeah, it just doesn't raise as many questions. And we wanna avoid questions and digging into things.
yes, we do.
thoughts on that question? Any ATAC issues? Do we think that we can put on the ATAC that if it's not signed, it serves as notice that the buyer's terminating? Do we think that's a good idea?
Great question. I have no idea.
So,
I've never
I'm-
put it on that form, so.
yeah, and I'm seeing that some, which is why I wanted to ask, I would not put it on an ATAC. And here's why, the ATAC is not actually part of your contract unless it's fully executed. So if what you want is for your ATAC to serve as notice of termination if it's not signed, put that stipulation in the actual contract, like when you write your offer, send it over then. Now, do I recommend doing that as a habit? No, I don't. And the reason is that you don't know what's gonna come up on that inspection report. And maybe your buyer wants to ask them to change out all the doorknobs in the house, and that's what they're putting on the ATAC, and that's important to them. But like your buyer absolutely still wants to buy that house if the seller says, no, man, pay for your own doorknobs, right? If you have that stipulation in your contract and the seller's like, no, I'm not signing that, your contract is terminated. You would have to revive it. So reinstate it. You don't want to set yourself up for an unintentional termination. So I would really do that super sparingly. In fact, I don't know that I would ever do that out of habit. It's really just like maybe you go see a property and there's a ton of trees in the backyard and you know on the ATAC, you're gonna ask the seller to clear the trees out and you know that your buyer doesn't want the house unless they clear out the trees. That might be a situation where you put that in there. Because agents put that in there so they don't have to stay up until 11:59 to see if the ATAC gets signed. It feels less stressful for everyone, and that makes sense. But only if you know going in that there is something your buyer is going to ask for and will only buy the house if the seller agrees to it. So just be careful on that. I see people doing that wrong, and also I see ATACs not getting signed and everyone just moving forward and that stip being in the contract, moving forward as if it's fine.
And they really are technically terminated.
Yeah, which, I mean, if everyone is fine, like, no harm, no foul, sure. But what if everyone is fine and then the day before closing, the buyer does something that really ticks off the seller and the seller's like, well, you don't get to buy my house anymore. Well, the buyer's got no leg to stand on because the contract's already terminated. So like, there is nothing that the buyer can force the seller to do. So don't accidentally terminate your contracts or set yourself up for that. But I'm seeing that on a lot of them.
That's a great idea.
I agree, but some agents just out of
Yeah,
habit.
in
put
your
that-
tree scenario, that makes sense. I
Yeah,
just think it would be very rare that would be. a
I
good
agree,
idea.
but some agents put it in every contract. And I think the reason they do that is so they want their ATAC to seem more powerful and like pressure the seller into signing it. Which there's probably some validity there, but just be careful. To me, the downside is greater than the upside. And if it turns out that your buyer really, really, really wants, they found some sort of like, was it polybutylene piping or something? And they're like, I don't want the house unless they fix it. You can still terminate within your due diligence period. And there's no, like, if you wanna go to bed at 8 o'clock and your buyer's like, I'm too stressed, it's getting too close, you can terminate. You just send over the TNR. So you don't really lose anything by not having that, other than like a little bit ease of operation, which again, to me is not worth it.
So if they did put that stip in the contract and then they sent an ATAC and the seller's like, no, I'm not doing that, but I'll do this, like, is there any negotiating then? Or is that ATAC, how it's written, signed or not signed, you're terminating or not?
Depends on how the stip is written.
Yeah.
And so I don't think GAR has a stip for that, because I don't think
They
GAR
don't.
thinks it's a good idea. So it depends on how people write it. But typically, it's like if an ATAC is submitted and not signed, that ATAC will serve as notice of termination. So to me, that means that specific ATAC. So if you're negotiating, what you would need to put on the ATAC that ends up occurring is stipulation 1B is hereby removed from the contract, or whatever it is. Is how I would, yeah, I would pull that out, but again, easier to just not have it in there, but if you are wanting to use it, don't put it in the HVAC, because that's not actually part of your contract unless it's signed. At which point your termination clause means nothing because it's signed, right? So I've been seeing that. Been seeing a lot of fraudsters being very creative. I don't know if you've seen an uptick in that. Recently.
I feel like we just, yeah, I think probably.
Cause like we're constantly
It's
bombarded with
commonplace
it.
now.
It's commonplace, but it's worse now. At least we've seen so many issues. I've had a couple of like wiring instruction issues come up where people have received fraudulent wiring instructions.
Oh, wow.
I had one where the lender wired $1.2 million to a fraudster because they didn't call to verify. That was traumatic for everyone involved.
Wow.
Yeah, that was bad. I had another one where a buyer had like a bit of a helicopter mom, if you will. And the mom was helping buy the house, and so she like had her hands in every little thing, which annoyed everyone in the transaction, like the agents and stuff. So annoyed with it. But to her credit, and then everyone loved her, she got fraudulent instructions, but since she was so like detail oriented and had her hands in everything, she noticed that the email was different, that the phone number was different. She called the number that she knew to call, so we could say, no, those are not our wiring instructions, don't send that. And so that was, she turned out to be really helpful and useful. But we had that, and then in that same transaction, because I think maybe one of the agent's emails got hacked. From the other side, we also got a fraudulent, like we received a fraudulent email that was like, hey, we would like to wire the proceeds to this account, can you update our wiring instructions? Which luckily the listing agent was the seller and I know her really well, so it was less uncomfortable for me to call and be like, I know this is not you, so like if you want to wire your funds, you're gonna have to come back in and sign a form. But just know I've seen an uptick in it. And the most important thing you can do for your clients for the wiring instructions is tell them, A, put the correct number for the closing attorney on the contract. So that's step one. So if you're closing in Peachtree Corners, put our phone number on there, like double check it, make sure it's our phone number, put that on there. Because that's a trusted number for your buyer to call to verify those instructions. And we always say, call us to verify these instructions. But if you also, and like our number is online, it's easy to find, but if you put it in the contract, that's something that your buyer can trust. So they receive the instructions, they call, they verify, everybody's happy, they send the money, we actually get the money, and that's good stuff. Unfortunately, the lender who wired the money didn't bother to call us to verify, obviously. And we send it out through an encrypted service. And that's why we do that, is because emails can get hacked. So if we're just naked emailing it to you, our email could get hacked. So we send it through an encrypted service, so it cannot be hacked on the exit. So if there is a fraudulent wiring instruction situation, it'll be because the recipient was hacked. And these people are so good at their jobs. Like they're really, really, really high level. And what they do is like, they would hack into the buyer's email. They would see, because the buyer receives it as either an email or, we try to do a text message for buyers. Lenders, typically we can't text, we have to email it. But they'll sit there, or they'll see an email that comes through from Mina that says, hey, I'm about to send you our encrypted wiring instructions, this is how you open them. And so then what they'll do is they'll send their own email, pretend that it's from Mina, let's say, hey, I actually am gonna send it to you this way because it's more user friendly, use these instructions. And then if buyers say, okay, and send it, they've just wired that money to another country. So call to verify, so we can fix that, but I've seen a lot more than normal on the fraud front.
Yeah, I would say definitely. And even with our emails, which are very protected, I get more stuff that's phishing, to my Onward-ish email address. And I mean, some of them they're getting better. But I mean, and they'll post it from title companies or attorneys all the time. It'll be like, I don't get this stuff. But yeah,
A lot of
it's,
spam from lenders.
Yep.
Please click on this link to get your package for the clerk.
yeah, and we're reiterating that to their clients, so I think if they hear it 12 times, that's good. So, we may call you as the agent, be telling them that, a couple things, they will not get wiring instructions from you, they will not get wiring instructions from me. They will only get wiring instructions from the attorney. And, then reiterating to them, once you get it, call them at the number that's in the contract. I think that's brilliant. So many contracts I get do not have a phone number at all for the attorney. And, it's obviously it's nice for us when it's there, or it'll just say, oh, Kelly, and it doesn't say which office, there's 50 offices. So, doing that extra step, coming from what you just said is just another reason. It's not even just, it's convenient to have it there and everyone can look, but as a mode of protection to be like, this is the trusted number for the office where you are closing. If you ever have any questions, that's the number you call. When you want to verify those wiring instructions, you call that number. Because I mean, I even hear things now, you can Google it and hackers will put up a number you can Google a number and they'll put up a fraudulent number, for companies now. So I mean, it's kind of creepy.
They're very high level, so every little thing that we can all do and every little tidbit we can impart into buyers and sellers is just one more step in helping keep their money safe. And on the flip side for the seller, front, just like as a reminder, we have to wire money or cut a check, however they want it, to the actual sellers on title. So if you have like a multi-layered company, so ABC LLC is the parent company, but DEF LLC is our actual seller. A lot of times that company will say, just wire it to ABC. I can't, I gotta wire it to DEF, and you have to give me wiring instructions to DEF. And if you don't have a bank account set up for DEF, you need to get a bank account set up, because the only other option I have is to cut you a check, and then you can deposit it when you get that bank account set up. Or maybe your bank would let you endorse it to the other company, but I think banks are cracking down a little bit on stuff like that too, because if we're seeing fraud, banks are seeing fraud on their side. But also anytime a seller says, I want to change my wiring instructions, it's a hard no. And we try so hard to not like give no's, we try to give ways that we can accomplish what y'all want to accomplish. But just because of the fraud scenario, if a seller fills out wiring instructions at the table, the only time I would ever change them is if for some reason I know that that's not right. Right, like if I know there's a mistake, which 99.9% of the time I will not know. But if we wire and they forgot a zero and it bounces back, we might call to say, hey, I think you filled these out wrong. You want to come back in and refill them out? If I'm calling and asking, fine. But if the seller just calls in and says, hey, I actually want it to go to my Wells Fargo account instead of my Bank of America account, we'll have to honestly just give them a no, unless you're gonna come back into the office with all of the other sellers and fill out new instructions. And then we're happy to do it, which admittedly frustrates people, but it's not as frustrating as losing your money. So
Yeah.
we're pretty strict on that front, unfortunately. Because the hackers, there were no hackers, it's insurance about
Yeah.
them.
Well, yeah, ultimately you're protecting them, so.
Right. But not everyone sees it that way.
It's like a parent-child.
So I'm not you
this is
guys,
what-
I'm not promoting the movie The Beekeeper. Have any of you seen it?
No.
No.
Okay, so I'm not promoting the movie because it's very, 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 very violent. But oh my gosh, excellent movie still on principle, and that's what it's about. The money, the woman gets all of her money taken, and that's where it goes from there, because he's protecting the hive. But anyway, her money was taken by a hacker, and it's interesting the system and how deep it goes and how involved they are and how good they are. So
And what
it's very,
they do, these hackers, they'll like, so you send it to a bank account that's similar they will send it to a bank account that's similar to what they thought they were sending it to. And within minutes of it being in that account, the hacker bounces it to another account, and then they'll split it up and bounce it to the point where you're never gonna be able to untangle the web to even locate the money to try to get it back. So it's
Yeah.
not that it goes to some account and, because people are like, well, why don't they just shut down the account? It's fraud. I mean, they will, but the money's already gone, so it doesn't help you to do that at all. So it's not, luckily, the over $1 million wire that the lender sent, it was caught so quickly that they did actually get it back, which is
Oh, wow, that's good.
a huge blessing. But that's rare, so don't count on the success stories, scare your clients with the bad stories, so don't do it.
Hey, guys, this is Kat. I have a quick, and
Okay.
it's changing the subject though, so sorry.
Yeah. So this is
Okay.
for,
I have a question about an FHA loan. So I listed a property this weekend and I've gotten a few FHA offers. My question is, the repairs required in the FHA commitment, what's a reasonable cost for the buyer to ask the seller to pay or not to exceed? Do you know what I mean? Like 500, 5,000?
Yeah, I mean, coming from what I usually see a lot on those contracts, it's usually around 500. It kind of depends, if the property is in good condition, but is the property in good condition, Kat?
It is, but the buyers are asking, said 5,000 in total costs.
That's a lot.
I know. Okay.
I was gonna say, Erin looks at these a lot more than I do,
Yeah.
because it rarely comes up like in the closing, but when it does, I typically see anywhere from like 500 to 1,000. But I would think A, condition, and then B, sales price would matter, like you might, even if it's good condition, if it's a $2 million home, I would probably put more, because the same repair in a 2 million versus a 400,000, it's gonna, like, that cost difference alone, because there's probably a bigger house, is gonna make a difference. I don't even know if you get an FHA loan for a $2 million.
You can't, they have to be putting down a lot of money actually, but, I mean, it's possible.
To illustrate the point, the higher the sales price might justify a higher cost, but I don't know that I've ever
At
seen.
5,000, I've never seen that, Kat. I think that's crazy high. Cause what seller's gonna be like, yeah, okay.
Well, yeah. And then, yeah, I agree. And I listed it for 300,000. And all right, so I think they're going to even change it from FHA to a conventional, but I just want to make sure that I'm not having my seller sign something that is going to bite her.
Yeah, I would say if they like everything else about the offer, I mean, they should be able to counter it back and change that 5,000 to say 500 or whatever your sellers are comfortable with.
Yeah. Well, that's what I normally ask for is 500. And I thought, oh my gosh, am I not doing my buyers right? But
No,
okay.
no, yeah.
So I have another question about this same offer.
Okay.
The buyer's agent is waiving the commission because it's her son who's buying the property. So in the special steps, they wrote, the buyer's agent waives the seller's paid buyer's commission of $9,000. Is that the right way to do that? I already signed the instructions to closing attorney, but is that, I've never had.
Is she wanting the commission to go to her son, or is she saying there's no commission needed for the buyer side?
She's saying waiving it, she's
That's what it
waiving.
sounds like, but that seems funny to me.
That seems like.
It seems like she would be saying like, I want my commission to go like to my kid toward it,
Right.
But she's not saying that though, she's not trying to say that, she's actually saying you don't have to pay commission to the buyer's agent at all.
And she put the exact number. She put the exact amount of commission, like $9,195.
Yeah.
So I'm like, well, what happens if the sale price changes, which hopefully it won't, and maybe she doesn't want that to go to his closing costs, because I hope she's not going to try to ask for that later. You know what I mean?
So I've always said, don't put commission stuff in the contract. I know that's changed a little bit with all of the changes, with all the lawsuits coming out and how we've changed the contract. They've added, the GAR has come out with that special stipulation where the buyer can ask the seller to pay the commission that they're obligated to pay. But I would still say that maybe the better route, instead of putting it in the contract, and I don't know if you were here at any of the events where Melba was talking about the co-op commission agreement form. I think she had it in the sense where the listing says the buyer's agent gets 0%, but the listing agent's like, you know what, I can get my seller to pay your 3%. Then you have that co-op agreement, co-op commission agreement signed. I wanna say it's 258. I could be mistaken, double check me, but it's the co-op commission agreement form. But I think you could use it in this scenario too. So what it is both agents agreeing to what the commission is gonna be. So I would fill that out with her and the instructions to closing attorney. Because the co-op agreement is between the two of you guys saying, we agree that the listing agent is getting 3% and the buyer's agent is getting 0%. And then you turn around and instruct the closing attorney that the listing agent is getting 3% and the buyer's agent is getting 0%. That to me is better than putting it in the contract. Cause you bring up a good point that if the price changes, could that change the commission? All of a sudden your seller owes, $100 to her because the price went up. Less likely, but to me, it's cleaner to keep it out of the contract, because I feel like it gives the buyer and the seller the impression that they can negotiate y'all's money, which is not really what it's supposed to be. Like, the buyer can negotiate with their agent what their obligation is, and the seller can negotiate with their agent what their obligation is, but the buyer and the seller shouldn't be able to decide what the agents are getting paid. So to me, I would do the co-op commission agreement and the instructions to closing attorney and pull it out of the contract.
Okay, and change the 5,000 to 500.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you wanna make sure you get that co-op commission agreement signed before your contract.
Well, so that's why, and actually the agent's in our office, so that's wonderful. And I totally trust her. I'm just like, let me double check on this. But, so she already did send the instructions to closing attorney, but it's the co-op that's also needed.
Yeah, now that being said, if it came down to a lawsuit and the instructions to closing attorney are signed, I think that other agent would have a really hard time saying, oh no, I didn't intend for that to be the case, but you don't wanna get to that point, right? You want it super clear from the get-go. Cause like, we don't get the brokerage agreement, but we get the contract, but I think having that co-op agreement solidifies that both agents agreed, and then both agents did the same thing when they instructed the closing attorney on how to pay them, which was set up and defined by other agreements, which is how the instructions has always been set up. It's just relaying predetermined information to the attorney.
The
Right.
only thing about that F-258, Ashley, is that it actually says on there that it's supposed to be signed before showing. So,
Oh, you're right, Sandy.
Hmm.
You're right, I forgot it said that.
Well,
Good
well,
point.
technically, LOL, but technically she didn't show it. I showed it. But
well, there you go. Then it is prior to showing.
I'll have to think on it for future situations, what the best route is, because I'm still resistant to putting it in the contract. But if we're gonna say the instructions to closing attorney just relays other information that's decided, then is there a gap there? So I'll think on that, but if she didn't show it, that might work in this scenario. And I'm not gonna say it is wrong to have it in the contract, I just think it sets the wrong impression for the deal, is why I don't like it, not because it's illegal or illegitimate or doesn't hold water. It does, it just is not the preferred way.
For a lot.
well, I knew I didn't like it. I just didn't know why. It just didn't sit.
Didn't
Yeah.
sit well with you. Yeah. Well, and to Kat, back to the, repairs, if you change that and counter 500 or 1,000, whatever your seller's comfortable with, I mean, they can always pay, they can always do more than that. You're just not making them liable for, or, you know, they're not saying, I'll do up to $5,000. You know, they could, if you change it to 500, but it needs 1,000, they can choose to be like, okay, yeah, we'll agree to do that one. Anyway,
Yeah,
so,
and be careful on that, because if it does end up, let's say $800 are the needed repairs and 500 is what you put in there. What's supposed to happen is there's supposed to be an itemized cost of that $300, like why it's gonna cost that extra $300 on top of the 5 to equal the 8. And then the buyer and the seller have to negotiate on who's gonna pay for it. And it's either 2 or 3 days, there's a time frame where if there's no resolution, the contract automatically terminates. So just be careful on that and make sure it's done in the time frame if it exceeds that amount you put in there, so you don't have that unintentional termination.
Right. You know, we almost dealt with that. Remember Ashley with the mobile home that just closed Friday? But
yeah.
with the furnace and all, anyway, we won't bring that up.
Close. Leaving it with good vibes.
Yes, it was great. Everybody's happy. I'm thrilled.
Good.
So,
Good, good.
well, thank you.
Yeah, of course.
All right, y'all. Any other quick questions?
Thank you guys so much.
Of course, thank you all for joining us. We enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Take care.
See
Thank
y'all
you
later.
both. Thank you guys.